Hi, I'm Daniel Foster. I'm the Chair and Associate Professor in Liberal Arts at Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins University. At 8 p.m. on October 30th, 1938, 6 to 12 million Americans tuned in to Orson Welles' adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds. It seems that some listeners, nobody knows how many, believed what the show's all-male dramatist personae alleged, namely that Mars was invading New Jersey. Gullible? Maybe, but that same night, at the same time, even more people tuned in to the Chase and Sanborn Hour. Most listeners, again, there are no exact numbers, tuned in to hear the reason for this show's 4-year streak as America's most popular program, Edgar Bergen's Ventriloquism Act. Even more gullible? Perhaps, but surely it mitigates the charge that Wells conned half the country if we know the other half was enjoying ventriloquism on the radio. Moreover, given pre-war news bulletins, Gullible doesn't do justice to the country's mood of anxious vigilance. Wells invaded New Jersey 29 days after Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, and just as many miles from where the Hindenburg, only a year earlier, had gone from spark to ash in 30 seconds. On the eve of World War II, one didn't need unchecked imagination to envision an invasion raining death from above. This Halloween marks the 85th anniversary of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. If you're interested in whether listeners believed the invasion was real, expect a bumper crop of articles on the subject this harvest time. But wondering whether listeners believed this particular broadcast is not as illuminating as investigating why they believed in radio in general. Today, new media are embraced, then obsessed over with bewildering speed. Last year's startup is this year's must-have medium. Looking at Welles' broadcast from a broader historical perspective can help us better understand how, in general, we adapt to new media, as radio was in the 1930s, and how new media adapt to us. Fall 1938 didn't happen in a vacuum. Tire tracks lead up to and away from it. This talk follows those tracks in both directions. In other words, why we let radios invade our living rooms, and what they did there after blending in with the furniture. Radio in the 1930s, like many young media, was eager to explain itself. And because audio is invisible and evanescent, radio was that much keener to show people how it worked. Unlike visual objects, sounds don't exist on their own. They are always a combination of two things: a vibrating object and the perception of those vibrations as sound. Sound occurs at the junction of two things, like, for example, where the sea meets the shore. And, as with many such shifting, wavering places that are more idea than location, strange and beautiful things can happen there. We wade, wallow, stroll, run, crawl, kicking up sand and surf, playing in this nowhere space where sound is born. Or, to put to rest the tired paradox of whether a tree falling in the forest makes a sound, the answer is no. If no one's there to hear it, it only makes vibrations, not noise. But if we were in the forest and heard the tree crash down somewhere without seeing it, we might find this jarring or even frightening. Hearing something without seeing it feels uncomfortable, even uncanny. Why? Well, sound is just a special case of the sense of touch. It's touch at a distance. Vibrations move through the air, enter our ears, and then set our eardrums vibrating. But if there's no visible source to these vibrations, it can feel like being tapped on the shoulder by a ghost. We turn around and no one is there. These ideas about sight and sound were explored in myth long before we tried to explain them through science. The story of Orpheus's failed mission to the underworld exemplifies the difficulty of accepting disembodied or acousmatic sound. Orpheus, whose music is so powerful it silences the sirens, so beautiful it gives even Sisyphus surcease from his endless toil, and so inspirational it moves the Argonaut rowers to churn the sea into molten fire on their way to find the golden fleece. This Orpheus, the world's greatest musician, cannot in the end rely upon his sense of hearing to guide his wife safely back to life. Translated literally, the name Eurydice means beautiful voice. Orpheus simply cannot bear to hear this voice without endeavoring to see its source. He may be a hero like Jason and Heracles and all the other Argonauts, and he may be able to conquer hell, but Orpheus cannot control his human desire to see, to believe. In his own death, however, Orpheus does finally realize his capacity for disembodied sound. According to Ovid, after failing to bring Eurydice back to life, Orpheus swears off all women. But Dionysus' female devotees, the Bacchae, are so enraged by this they attack him, beat him to death, then rip off his head and heave it into the river Hebrus. As the head drifts and spins, carried gently along by the river's current and eventually out to sea, miraculously it begins to sing. No lungs, no chest, no diaphragm, only the megaphone of a mouth, broadcasting song with no other corporeal parts to support it. And though his body is somewhat diminished, Orpheus's musical charms are not. The gods themselves are enchanted. After drifting out to sea, they direct his head safely to the island of Lesbos. A lesbian priest then enshrines the head on an altar, where it seems to prophesize to those who come seeking advice. Or, for non-believers, a priest practices gastromancy, that is, the art of speaking from the belly, so it seems like one's voice originates from some place other than its true source. Using our natural sense of wonder at acousmatic sound, the priest creates a minor mystery. In other words, they perform a ventriloquism act, which brings us back to Edgar Bergen. Bergen's Vent Act suggests radio is essentially an electric ventriloquist's dummy, just wood stuffed with wires. So if you can accept ventriloquism, you could accept radio. True, radio's voice is thrown by a signal tower further than an arm's length away. And with radio, you snake an electric cord into a socket, while with ventriloquism, you plug your arm into a dummy. But the principle's the same. Like Pinocchio come to life, the wood speaks, even sings. Like Bergen's dummy, in War of the Worlds, Welles also creates an analog for radio. During the show's epilogue, he describes a grinning, glowing, globular invader of our autumnal living rooms. The analogy begins to make sense once we learn that the popular cathedral-style radio of the 30s resembles a face when its vacuum tubes glow red-orange behind dial eyes, a button nose, and a smirk of frequencies. The meaning? Radio is like a jack-o'-lantern. By comparing his broadcast to a carved pumpkin, Welles pretends his monophonic destruction of the East Coast is reversible. It was merely a prank. He even calls it a member of the pumpkin patch and claims that because his cast didn't have enough time to soap everybody's windows, they did the next best thing. They annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. And then he goes on to tell us not to worry, that these institutions are still open for business. But in these words, we find a fair amount of vitriol and violence. Annihilated the world, utterly destroyed, as well as sarcasm, still open for business. At least there's enough here to make us believe that something more important than a prank is at stake. As evidence of this, Welles then tells us that he has tried to teach us a terrible lesson through War of the Worlds, one that we should not soon forget. So, what is this terrible lesson? While the broadcast certainly invites us to muse warmly over associations between radio and the innocent pastime of pumpkin carving, it also invites us to connect radio with a more impish, even sinister side of this Halloween icon, the Headless Horseman. After Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Welles's broadcast is perhaps the second most important American myth about Halloween. The third, gaining in sheer numbers if not in importance, is probably the Halloween film franchise. Though Irving and Welles are far from reducible to only one lesson, they are both deeply concerned with dismantling belief based on mere power. Irving reveals the foolishness of Ichabod Crane and his trust in the stories of Cotton Mather, who, along with his history of New England witchcraft, played an important part in the Salem witch trials. Similarly, Welles shows us no end of foolish authorities, from representatives of the military to university professors. His broadcast urges us to challenge the stories that power peddles as gospel. In fact, almost every time a member of Welles's patriarchal chorus of talking heads claims something to be true, the next moment they're proven wrong, often fatally. But unlike Ichabod Crane, who is a character inside the story that Irving narrates, Welles tests us, his listeners, who are outside the story that he tells. With Welles, it's not just the broadcast itself that matters. It's also how we reacted to that broadcast that has become part of America's Halloween mythology. How ironic then that rather than being remembered as the show that taught Americans to question authority, War of the Worlds is best remembered as proof of American gullibility. I'll return to this blurring of the boundaries between inside and outside of Welles's broadcast later, but at this point it may be helpful to remind ourselves of the live productions Welles staged in 1937-38. An anti-fascist performance of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Blitzstein's anti-capitalist opera Cradle Will Rock, Georg Büchner's anti-government epic Danton's Death, and the upside-down world of Thomas Decker's Shoemaker's Holiday, where class, education, and the military are all parodied and critiqued. Despite the different eras, genres, and media of these works, they share a similar distrust of patriarchal institutions. Significantly, there are no female voices in the War of the Worlds, only male ones. Grave, sagacious representatives of key social institutions like the military, the government, and higher education. Moreover, radio eagerly magnifies and dignifies these mouthpieces, giving them free publicity and a platform from which to declaim. Then, halfway through the first part of the broadcast, it even hands over to the state its signal towers and broadcast frequencies. Throughout the broadcast, these disembodied masculine voices repeatedly try to reassure us that they know best, that they have everything under control. We are encouraged to reward the self-confidence of their bold assertions with belief and allegiance. Even before we might suspect that anything is amiss, this methodical dismantling of authority begins as soon as the broadcast begins. After a short prologue, War of the Worlds opens with a seemingly innocuous weather report, announcing that a slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia.
Not much change in temperature. A slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia, causing a low-pressure area to move down rather rapidly over the northeastern states.
The weatherman is, of course, tragically mistaken. This is not a low-pressure system moving in from the north, but, as we will learn in 5 minutes, an invasion force from Mars. Next, our educational institutions fail us. The noted Princeton astronomer, Professor Pearson, played by Welles himself, being interviewed by fictional radio man Carl Phillips, reassures us that the chances of life on Mars are 1,000 to 1. Both men then indulge in a chummy laugh about the fact that the 40 million miles between Mars and the Earth should be enough to keep us out of reach of the Martians, assuming, of course, that aliens do turn out to be real. Ha ha ha. But then, as if fate were laughing back at them, immediately after this exchange, Pearson receives a note about something that pounded New Jersey with earthquake-like intensity. Asked by Phillips if this could have anything to do with the evenly timed explosions witnessed on Mars that evening, Pearson scoffs, "Hardly. It's just a coincidence," he reassures us. The seismic disturbance was probably caused by the impact of an unusually large meteorite.
9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote. Professor Pearson, could this occurrence possibly have something to do with the disturbances observed on the planet Mars?
Hardly, Mr. Phillips. This is probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence.
Then, as the Martian invasion intensifies, Welles undermines his authorities by breaking into regular programming with seemingly unplanned interruptions and impromptu musical interludes. But perhaps the most hair-raising way he silences these men is through silence itself. Shortly after Carl Phillips, the newsman who interviews as Welles' professor character, arrives at the point of impact, he, alongside the police, firemen, and many other men who thought they had the situation in hand, will be turned to dust by a Martian heat ray.
What anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
As the reporter's mic goes dead, an announcer back at the radio station reassures us that there's just some technical problem with the equipment. Once again, the voice of reassurance couldn't be less reassuring. All the wind that the newsman is blowing our way is nothing compared to the gust of dead air that comes before. This use of dead air produces some of the most chilling moments in radio history, but it bears little resemblance to the most common Hollywood aesthetic adhered to in the making of Steven Spielberg's 2005 version of War of the Worlds.
Is the lightning back?
No, this is something else.
It's interesting to note, though, that in order to make the scene more frightening, we are trapped in a basement, not allowed to see the sources of this horrendous noise. An acousmatic sound, noise without a visible origin, is almost always more frightening than a sound whose origins are visible. If a tree falls in the forest and we hear it but don't see it, we are unnerved when we hear the creaking of wood suddenly splintering into what sounds like 100 bones fracturing, followed by countless windows cracking as the tree's branches snap off during the tree's descent, crescendoing to an event that reminds us that sound is fundamentally vibration. As the tree crashes to the ground, we hear thunder in our ears and feel our legs tremble beneath us, unsteady at one end and death at the other. In our cinematic world of jaw-dropping visual effects set to bone-rattling sound effects, it seems unbelievable that something as simple and cheap as silence could so effectively pull listeners into a story. Though even in this clip, something like the cinematic equivalent of silence is used, in the black screen at the end. In general, when silence occurs on the radio, this means something has gone wrong with the broadcast. Or if a character has gone silent for a certain stretch of time, we may assume they have left the scene. Unlike visually based performance, a silent presence is impossible in audio. You are either present and making sounds, or soundless and assumed absent. In its most extreme form, which happened several times during Welles's broadcast, we interpret a sudden lack of sonic presence as death. For example, the swift shift from the sounds of pandemonium to the nothingness of the mausoleum when reporter Carl Phillips is killed by the Martian heat ray, which only moments before was heard sweeping towards him. Or consider the death of another reporter who, measuring the approach of a poisonous gas by city blocks, by imperial yards, and finally by feet, drops his microphone and goes silent because, presumably, he has also dropped dead.
Now the smoke's spreading faster. It's reached Times Square. People are trying to run away from it, but it's no use. They're falling like flies. Now the smoke's crossing 6th Avenue, 5th Avenue, 100 yards away. It's 50 feet.
Calling CQ. 2X2L calling CQ. 2X
X2L calling CQ, New York. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? 2X2L.
The equation is simple. Dead air equals death. The golden age of radio is sometimes known as the theater of the mind because radio is thought to more actively engage our imaginations than, for example, film. In audio drama, our brains must supply what's served up to us on a silver platter by the silver screen. In the case of silence, this interactivity is increased exponentially. We must, as it were, fill in all the blanks, not just the visual cues, but the sonic ones too. And left to their own devices, our minds can freely create much more horrible things than millions of dollars of CGI can. Even today, when I teach World of Worlds, my students and I still find these moments of dead air the most eerie and frightening. I can't imagine what it must have been like live in 1938. The compulsion to believe must have been enormous. Gullible? I don't know. But rather than recycle data and restage the debate between I believe and I don't believe, a more interesting idea emerges somewhere in between, in the realm of the X-Files tagline, I want to believe. Radio was the first popular medium to instantaneously shrink time and distance to almost nothing. Welles not only makes those limits disappear, he also blurs the boundaries between reality and fantasy. He sets the invasion right around the corner from its listeners and plays on audience anxiety over impending war and recent disaster. He cuts off reporters mid-sentence and abruptly silences mics, requiring listeners to fill the resulting dead air with their worst nightmares. Audiences didn't just passively hear this broadcast, they participated in it as in an immersive game, playing the roles of humans fleeing for their lives. They both did and did not believe themselves involved in the action. While one part of the brain excitedly imagined the invasion was real, another part scoffed. Though Welles the man did not have first-hand experience adapting to worldwide Armageddon, Welles the artist was world-renowned for his innovative retelling of stories in such different media as film, radio, and the live stage. It's still commonplace to list two of his works as the greatest examples of their kind. Of course, there's War of the Worlds for radio, but also Citizen Kane for film. Moreover, his live stage productions like Voodoo Macbeth made waves that are still rolling today. The first we've discussed here adapts a 19th century sci-fi novel. The second adapts the biography of a historical figure, William Randolph Hearst. And the third moves Shakespeare from Scotland to Haiti and uses an all-black cast. Along with many Americans in the 1930s, Welles heard what sounded like a death knell for vaudeville, mingled with the newborn cries of radio. In Darwinian theory, organisms must adapt to survive. Beyond the live stage, vaudeville kept itself alive by adapting to radio. Artists not only saved their own careers, but also their art forms. And once again, here we are, back with Edgar Bergen. A refugee from the fading world of vaudeville, Bergen found a new career on the radio, which in turn translated into even newer careers in film and television. Such adaptations, though, are not always one-way streets. Not only radio, but vaudeville also benefited from Bergen's wireless stardom. His success on the radio helped to revive the sale of dummies, which had been on the decline, and to raise the popularity of ventriloquism for a new generation. Back and forth, media, its artists, and their works help give life to the old and give birth to the new. Although not a vaudevillian himself, Orson Welles adored the medium, and would have certainly found work on the vaudeville stage as a magician. In 1938, the same year War of the Worlds was broadcast, Edgar Bergen was not the only showbiz personality helping to preserve vaudeville in a new form. That summer, Welles began one of his many lifelong obsessions, a silent film adapted from William Gillette's play with the double entendre title, Too Much Johnson. Although he never finished it, Welles planned to play 3 short silent films reminiscent of the Keystone Cops before each act of a live stage performance of the play. While this kind of multimedia performance might seem quite innovative, it's also old hat. During the early years of film, which were also the twilight years of vaudeville, short, silent films, often slapstick in nature, entertained audiences between live vaudeville acts. This idea of an interstitial film also dogged Welles throughout his life. It eventually found a prominent place in one of his last film projects, The Other Side of the Wind. No longer the wunderkind of Citizen Kane, but a Hollywood outcast and considered unemployable by many, Welles had experienced a luciferine fall from grace and was trying to connect the present depths to which he had sunk to the past heights from which he had fallen. He was desperate to make this film, but to film he must earn money, and to earn money he must work. But who would have him? Welles eventually found work doing TV ads, cashing in on his still considerable fame, screen presence, and preternaturally resonant voice. And even when putting his hand to these journeyman tasks, Welles rendered indelible such slogans as Paul Masson's, "We will sell no wine before it's time." Although it was not released during his lifetime, in 2018, producers Frank Marshall and Peter Bogdanovich, also one of the film's stars, scavenged all the footage they could find for The Other Side of the Wind and wove it into a cinematic testament to adaptation. The film contains 35mm, 16mm, and Super 8 footage in color and black and white, interspersed with pseudo-documentary and found footage that employs journalistic techniques reminiscent of the way Citizen Kane tells the story of a deeply flawed public figure, in this case, a filmmaker, not unlike Welles himself, and played by the iconic filmmaker John Huston. There are also many nods to vaudeville along the way, including some turns by famous vaudevillians like George Jessel and Benny Rubin, as well as vaudeville-adjacent performers like Angelo Rosito and Rich Little, ultimately replaced by Bogdanovich in the film's final version. Like Too Much Johnson, the film is also reminiscent of vaudeville in its form, insofar as a silent film is interspersed among the absolute circus of the great man's birthday party. And if that wasn't enough, Welles parodies the more recent cinematic techniques of filmmakers such as Michelangelo Antonioni, Federico Fellini, and John Cassavetes. New, old, and yet to be, the film is a monument to Welles's consummate ability to adapt, both as an artist and a person. By contrast, the Martians in War of the Worlds are not nearly as adaptable. And in fact, they perish because of this. As Professor Pearson informs us toward the end of the broadcast, the Martians were killed by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Microbes, not men, killed the Martians. Meanwhile, human beings don't die, because for eons, we've been adapting to these bacteria through an endless stream of runny noses. What's true at the level of the species is also true at the level of smaller groups and individuals. The best way to survive and thrive in a time of crisis and change is not to just keep doing the same old thing, but to figure out how best to adapt oneself to the new situation. And those who don't adapt don't survive, let alone thrive. That is why military planes, which keep using conventional weapons against the Martians, simply fall out of the sky, while the radio men, who keep broadcasting instead of running for cover, turn to ash or choke on poisoned gas. Certain works of art chafe against the limits of their medium, but because they reveal its possibilities, these are the sorts of works that most encourage us to embrace that medium. Looking backwards, they find inspiration in older forms like vaudeville. Straining forwards, they almost seem to will new ones into existence, like immersive experiences. And combining both, they create the paradox of a familiar innovation, like Wells's War of the Worlds. Marshall McLuhan once declared that the content of one medium is always another medium, like wine in a glass. But in the hands of an artist like Welles, certain media are less like a glass of Paul Masson red than a nest of Russian dolls.